Hello and welcome to the two-man power trip of a wrestling. Your host, JP John Poz. With me today, very special returning guest. He's, of course, an author, a wrestling historian, the man behind the Nitro book series. He is Mr. Guy Evans. Guy, welcome back. How you doing?
I'm doing great, John. Thank you so much for having me back. It's great to talk to you as always.
So, what is going on in your world? Seems like you have a new project here, maybe the biggest project that, as far as I could see, here on the Kickstarter about the Hulkster. What's going on with the latest?
Yes, that's right. I suppose by the time people are listening to this, hopefully the news will be out and everyone would have had chance to visit the page and check it out. But that's right. I'm about to embark on, I would say, the most ambitious project probably that I have got myself involved in to date, which is sort of saying a lot, seeing as what we know the Nitro and Beyond Nitro books turned into. But I've decided to tackle this time the subject of Hulk Hogan, and it's what I envision is not a typical wrestling biography. What I actually have in mind, and we can talk a little bit about how I got there, I suppose, is a biographical trilogy on the man and on the performer. And so I think that it's safe to say it's sort of going to be the first time that anything like that in the genre of wrestling books, at least, has been attempted. And as such, it's going to require a huge amount of time and effort and resources. And of course, there's going to have to be a number of things that I'm going to have to put to the side and perhaps delay and even call off entirely to focus on this project. So I'm looking for the support of the wrestling fans and Hulk Hogan fans and people who have checked out my books in the past to go to Kickstarter and help make this campaign and make this project a reality. Like I said, we're talking about 3 full-length books. And again, if you're familiar with my work, you'll know that these books can be rather detailed, to say the least, on Hulk Hogan, telling the story of his life, his career, his overall cultural impact. And I'm very excited about it, and I'm really excited to partner with you guys listening to this as well to make it a reality.
Before we get into the Hulkster, which chopping at the bit, obviously do that. But what about the Kickstarter as far as what they're going to be able to get when they do the Kickstarter?
Yeah, so this is where I think it's going to be a win-win, I suppose, for both parties. First of all, I should mention, how you can actually get to the Kickstarter page. So if you search for the Hulk Hogan Story, which is sort of the working title that we have at the moment, you'll find all of the information on Kickstarter, or just type in my name, Guy Evans, and you'll find everything that you need. But what's really nice about this campaign is not only are you helping actually bring the project to life, but you're essentially pre-ordering the books at a discounted rate relative to what they'll be retailing for when the books actually come out. So, it's not only that you're just helping get the project off the ground, but you're actually taking care of pre-ordering the books as well. So it certainly works out very nicely for both parties. But if you go on the page, you can have a look at the different reward tiers and what's possible based on your support. We are going to be offering a special hardcover edition of the book, which will not be reprinted for anyone else other than those who back at the appropriate level on Kickstarter. So in other words, after the campaign, we won't be producing any of those particular hardcover editions of the book, and there's a lot of cool rewards in there, including if you're a huge Hulkamaniac and you're very interested in perhaps even being a participant in this process, and you'd like to contribute some of your own thoughts and recollections on the Hulkster, then we have the opportunity for you to do that as well and actually become interviewed for the book. So if people go and check out the Hulk Hogan Story on Kickstarter, you'll see the various reward tiers and levels of support. But the reason, I suppose, I should sort of communicate why I've decided to go down this road as compared to sort of what I've done previously with my other projects. I should sort of start by saying this was something that I sort of began in earnest prior to the sad news earlier this summer that Hogan had passed away. So after I was done with the writing process for Beyond Nitro, which was the last book in the Nitro book series, as you mentioned, I had started doing some sort of rudimentary research and some interviews and kicking around the idea of doing a Hulk Hogan biography. But of course, once he passed away, I just got inundated with so many emails and DMs and messages of people saying, you should really consider writing something about Hogan. And as I said, to some small degree, something like that was already underway. But once I really started to dig into it more, I realized to try to contain this story into a single volume is really not would really not be doing the story justice. And if ever there was a figure in wrestling that deserved a series of books, it would be Hulk Hogan. Whatever you may think about him personally, whether you're a fan of his or not, you can't argue with his significance in the history of wrestling as being the most famous professional wrestler who ever lived. And so once I really started looking at what I already have and what I plan to do, I said, this needs to be a series of books. And in order to make that a reality, quite frankly, I'm going to have to put some things on the back burner. There's some people who would like for me to work with them that I'm going to have to say no to. And so in order to sort of justify all of that and the time investment required, I'm looking to partner with people to make it come to life. And I think, again, if you just look at Nitro, you look at Beyond Nitro, you look at the books that I wrote with Eric Bischoff, the books I did with David Penzer, I think it's safe to say that the final product is going to be something that probably, exceeds your expectations. So I'm really excited to get started. And the official launch, I should mention, of the campaign is on the 21st, 21st of October. So by the time you guys are listening to this, if you go to the page, you can sign up for updates and you can get notified the day that the campaign goes live. But the actual date when everything goes official is 10/21. So make a note of that and be on the lookout for that.
Love that. This is such a cool and awesome venture. I mean, obviously the other books we know about, Nitro, Beyond Nitro, Bischoff, and the two Bengers are awesome. But this is something where I feel like the legacy of Hulk Hogan needs to be, obviously 3 books, but needs to be out there in more of a positive light for what he did for the business. Because to be honest, I don't know if the business would be where it is today without the Hulkster. And I know Triple H has said that even on ESPN as recently as 2 weeks ago. So it's just one of those things where I totally agree. Where would wrestling be without the Hulkster? We need to secure that legacy.
Yeah, and I think it's sort of unfortunate, again, putting to the side for the second, the fact that unfortunately there was a serious tarnishing of the guy's legacy that occurred in the last 10 to 15 years, and we don't need to relitigate why that was. Everyone knows that by this point. But I think what was sort of unfortunate is in the aftermath, of his death, the conversation more or less in terms of the legacy media and other outlets sort of revolved around that one issue. And the conversation was essentially all about, was this guy really this virulent racist or not? And, it's sort of one of those questions where if you sort of come down strongly on one side of the issue, you're going to make your case and other people are going to make their case. But I don't think, if you believe one thing in relation to that answer, you're ever going to sort of be convinced of another thing. So it ultimately becomes sort of counterproductive, I would argue, to sort of constantly swirl that around when obviously there's no defense for what the guy said, and like I said, he did seriously tarnish his legacy, and I don't think he ever got past that. And we can see that in his final appearance in Los Angeles in terms of the way he was received by the crowd, and that was probably going to be in his future for the foreseeable future. But the reason why I sort of frame it in that way is I think to myself, as at the same time that discussion or conversation was going on, you had so many people who grew up as Hulkamaniacs, or people who were affected by sort of the Hogan phenomenon in the 80s, who were coming out and sort of reflecting on their own childhood, reflecting on their fandom, going back and revisiting what an inspiration the guy had been for them at a particular point in their life. I mean, I'm sure as you saw this as well, John, so many people, whether they be fans or athletes, entertainers, actors, talking about, this guy motivated me to get in the gym, or this guy, made me want to start training because I really believed in what he was saying, or, when I watched his matches as a child, I truly was inspired by what I was seeing. And I think that counts for something, and that shouldn't be ignored. It shouldn't be discounted, and the history, shouldn't be swept under the rug, regardless of what happened thereafter. And I think the sort of overarching question here, which I think needs to be answered and documented for history's sake, is how did a sort of admittedly shy and rather awkward kid from Tampa, who, if you look at his upbringing, if you look at his family, nothing necessarily there that would indicate this guy is destined for greatness, how did this person become legitimately one of the most famous people in the world, operating in a business which traditionally sort of skews a little bit more towards the niche side of things? That's not to say, obviously, there haven't been, mainstream huge wrestling stars before Hogan, after Hogan. We're not saying that at all, but we're saying, a professional wrestler at that particular time was able to make an impact not only on the business but on the culture at large, and become one of the most recognizable people, like I said, not only in America but across the entire world. And going back and revisiting that and documenting that, I think, is important, not only for sort of historians or students of the wrestling business to make note of and be aware of, but also just for sort of posterity's sake. That's a very interesting set of questions, and a very interesting story that I'm really excited about getting into. And that's the part of this which sort of intrigues me the most, is to look at his ascent in the 80s, the reinvention in the 90s, sort of his attempts to sort of stay relevant in the 2000s, and then ultimately, what I would say would be sort of the collapse of his public reputation and image, which occurred, in the last 10 or 15 years. So there's so much to this. You're not only telling the story of a man, you're telling the story of an industry, and even, the culture at large as well, because you look at his presentation in the 80s as this all-American, patriotic, good guy. That exact same presentation 15 years later would have positioned him as a heel. The culture and the audience had moved on to such an extent where, that would have been seen and viewed as passé at that point, whereas it was anything but, in an earlier era. So by touching on these things, it kind of gives you a license to put all of this stuff in context, and to delve into some of those external factors as well. And so, as you can probably tell, I'm really looking forward to it.
Yeah, man, and you probably already have, like you kind of alluded to, you probably already have a lot of info from a lot of different wrestlers, just because you've been working on Nitro, Beyond Nitro, and obviously with Bischoff, you probably have a lot of, like, you're probably ahead of the game even on covering some of this Hulk stuff.
Absolutely. And again, that was another reason why I sort of started to dip my toe in the waters earlier this year and think about doing this, is because I began to realize, if I was to simply just go back and look at some of the interviews I've already conducted and some of the conversations, that I've had with people in the wrestling business, as you said, we're really sort of ahead of the game when it comes to a lot of information that I think, can be quickly generated about this particular subject. But that is where the majority of the content in this series of books is going to come from, is the people who are actually there, the people who lived it, the people who worked with and against Hogan. And I think there's a lot of areas that people wouldn't necessarily expect that are going to come out from these books as well. And I can say that confidently based on some of the interviews that I've already conducted and some of the information I already have. Yes, of course, it's going to be touching on, the big moments, the big matches, primarily what was happening in the guy's wrestling career. But I think you're going to see, with 3 books at our disposal, we're going to be able to really go into a lot more detail than that.
The thing is, too, with Hogan, and obviously it's kind of surprising, it hasn't really been covered enough, for far as my estimation. Like, I feel like there should be more Hogan stuff for the impact that he had. I mean, the Michael Jordan, the Babe Ruth, whatever huge, Tiger Woods, whatever huge name you want to associate, that's Hogan with wrestling. There isn't wrestling without him. I feel like there hasn't been enough on him. So this is like kind of almost like scratching the surface, really.
That's right, and I think sometimes we can fall into the trap of feeling like there's sort of an inevitability to things where, well, if it wasn't Hogan, it would be someone else, and someone would have come along at some point in time to make that kind of cultural impact. But I don't think that that's true, and I think most people who have been longtime fans of wrestling and understand, you know, how rare it is to have a star of that magnitude will also hear what I'm saying on that. You know, he was the exact right guy at the exact right time, you know, working with Vince McMahon, of course, in what really was a partnership back then in the 80s. And of course, this all coinciding with some of the technological changes which really assisted in wrestling's boom throughout the decade as well. You know, of course, in the realm of fiction, you remember, you know, Vince McMahon going on TV when he was feuding with Hogan and saying, "I could have had anyone play that spot," and you know, essentially there was nothing special about Hulk Hogan. We could have cast anyone in that role, and of course, you know, in reality, that certainly isn't the case at all. And you know, there's something to be said for that. And again, that does need to be understood. It does need to be documented. It does need to be recognized, because if millions of children and adolescents, you know, regard this person, at least for a period of time, maybe not anymore, but for a period of time, regard them as a serious inspiration. And if this character is really an entry point for untold numbers of viewers to actually get interested in wrestling, then that's something that certainly deserves a deep dive. And that's not even getting into the way that he, you know, reinvented himself in the 90s with WCW and the NWO, where it certainly appeared at a particular point in time that he was you know, really dead in the water. And we used the word passe before. He had certainly reached that point in WCW where that good guy shtick and that sort of paint by numbers routine had really ran its course, you know, by 95, early part of 96. And it's kind of an interesting thought experiment to think about, where would he have gone, you know, if he hadn't have made that decision to turn heel and join Hall and Nash. Yes, you know, with wrestling being wrestling, and you know, of course, never say never is the axiom that we all abide by. Probably likely that if he hadn't have made that turn, he would have wound his way back with the WWF at some point. But I don't think his career would have had that additional staying power and that you know, that additional set of legs that he gave to it by turning heel. And I think he was, you know, a magnificent heel. I think, you know, that's another element among many that we could get into when it comes to Hogan's career, is the fact that he was the consummate babyface, but also that he was putting to the side, you know, maybe if you look at it through a more modern lens, you might say, well, what was the guy really doing in the ring? And I never found him as a performer to be that compelling. But in terms of, if we look at it through the lens of business, what he was able to generate being in that top heel spot, at least for a period of time, you know, the guy was not only able to reinvent himself, but to do it, you know, at a very similar level relative to what he achieved as a babyface. So I think there's very few people, if any, in the history of wrestling that could say that they were, you know, the top face in the business for a long period of time, and then equally the top heel, at least in terms of a national promotion at that level, in the era of weekly, you know, cable television, and being able to maintain it for as long as he did. So there's so many fascinating elements of this to get into.
I know I'm such a big Hogan mark. I'm such a huge Hogan fan, but I always said it, and I do think it's true, whether people agree or not. But I think he was the greatest babyface of all time, and I think he was the greatest heel. So it's insane to think that the same guy could be both, but he really was. I feel like he was obviously that good with Hogan era and Hulkamania, and he was that good with the NWO and Hollywood Hogan and turning heel. I don't know if you agree, but I think you could easily make the argument he's the best heel and best babyface of all time.
Absolutely. I think you can certainly make that argument, as you said, and it would be a pretty easy case to make. And, you know, it was just, if you go back and look at those old shows and review the footage, the way the guy's charisma shone through in both roles, right? Where he was an intensely likable babyface, at least, you know, for quite some time. But even as a heel, he was truly that guy that you love to hate, you know, and there was, I think, sort of some unintentional comedy at times with the Hollywood Hogan presentation, which in a very unique way did not detract from his ability to generate heat when he needed to as a heel. Even when he was, sort of riffing with Hall and Nash and trying to be hip and trying to be cool and so on and so forth, none of that actually took away from the fact that when appropriate, he could be this vicious, really down in the gutter heel who would, take things out on the baby faces and obviously at the appropriate time position himself relative to the baby faces. You think about how in that build up to the Sting Hogan match, how he did such a great job of cowering from Sting and pretending that he was absolutely terrified of the ultimate sort of one-on-one matchup. Now, obviously, what ended up happening was a debacle, and I've covered that pretty thoroughly in my other books, and obviously we'll get into it in this book series as well, which is a whole other set of questions in terms of his ability as a heel to do the right thing at times and to put people over and to understand when it was time to pass the torch, and those sort of debates will go on forever. But to return to your original question, I think it would be a fairly easy job to make that case. Certainly he's absolutely in the discussion, and I suppose it makes it even more baffling as to why, with such a successful heel run, you think about the way that they transitioned back to the babyface Hulk Hogan and coming out in the red and yellow, which was essentially done as a 1 week sort of pop or surprise on an episode of Nitro. You go back and you look at a viewer and you think about how else they could have built that up or how else they could have made that a bigger deal. But that's sort of indicative of a lot of the stuff that was going on with WCW at the time, where they would build up these huge storylines and huge programming frameworks and then completely change gear in a week with no reference to what had happened before. But absolutely, the guy was just marvelous in both roles. And even when he went back to the WWF, you think about in 2000, I think most people who were watching at the time would say, this is the end of the run. This guy is not a draw on pay-per-view anymore. A Hulk Hogan match really doesn't mean anything in terms of drawing a rating or getting people to purchase an event. And then you just fast forward to, of course, that famous match with The Rock at WrestleMania 18 and the crowd reaction he was able to garner. Obviously, the fact that it was in Toronto, that's certainly a mitigating factor in that. But quite remarkable to see how he once again was able to pivot and somewhat reinvent himself when it truly did look, towards the end of his WCW run that really there was nothing left to extract from this character. But as I said, you fast forward to 2002, and once again, for that night at least, he was the biggest star of them all.
It is crazy to think like, oh, he's got nothing left. Austin doesn't want to feud with him. Like in Austin, obviously he was the big guy, and like, what is Hogan going to be able to draw with The Rock? And it was just insane. It was such obviously proved that he was such a good draw. He proved that he could still do it. It's just one of those things where, I don't know, maybe Vince kind of had the feeling of it. I don't know. Hogan definitely had the feeling of it, that he still had a lot left in the tank. But you just look at that return too. I mean, obviously even 05, him and Shawn Michaels drew pretty well, and that SummerSlam and everything. So he still had it. I feel like once you're that big of a star, once you have that charisma, they get that nostalgia factor, you could still draw. You know what I mean?
That's right. That's right. And of course, there does come a limit to that. And we could probably say by the time he got himself involved in TNA, we were perhaps past the point of that nostalgia being a drawing card for people, because, now it wasn't the occasional pay-per-view match with a Shawn Michaels or a Randy Orton. Now it's the guy is going to become a weekly character on a television show, appearing in multiple segments. And, if you look at that initial reaction to his involvement in TNA, very successful in terms of drawing eyeballs to that first night. But obviously it was going to be diminishing returns, every time he appeared thereafter. And if you remember, they have an audience that peaks at nearly 3 million viewers on January 4th, 2010, when he makes his Impact debut. March the 8th, he's making an in-ring appearance, and it means nothing, practically speaking. Impact gets decimated, in a head-to-head contest with Raw. And, if people remember the presentation of that, they tried to sort of be cute with sort of presenting the match in the first segment, and then we're going to finish things in the main event segment, and trying to again thread his involvement throughout the show. And it really didn't pay off in anything materially in terms of people actually sticking with the program or choosing to watch it over Raw. So certainly by the time we got, to that point, the idea of Hulk Hogan, meaning that much, other than sporadic appearances or that big pop when he did debut, certainly those days were behind him. But you're absolutely right. It was, several years after his WCW run where he could still be relied upon to draw a very sizable pay-per-view buy rate and draw a great reaction from the crowd. But I think ultimately there did come a limit to that.
For sure, like overdone with TNA, but that was their biggest rating ever, and obviously without him, they never get that rating. So there's always a give and take. It's like you got to use the attraction correctly. Vince seemed to be able to use Hogan correctly for the most part, but it always seemed like TNA kind of overused it and tried to use him too much, but needed to treat him more like an attraction.
You're absolutely right, and I think it speaks to the less is more sort of discussion, which you see that in Hogan's presentation as a wrestler, right, where the guy really didn't do that much, but was able to maximize everything that he did do and could get, a more sizable reaction by looking at the crowd relative to another wrestler or compared to another wrestler, killing themselves with, 700 flips in and outside of the ring. But in terms of, his presentation as an inactive wrestler, it was anything but that. The guy was, enveloped the entire show. And again, you're always going to have a situation where it's going to be diminishing returns, and his presence on the show is not going to mean as much as time goes on. But with what TNA were paying him, the reports at the time were they were paying him in the region of $1 million a year to be that sort of figurehead and authority figure on the show. I suppose the thinking was, if the guy's not going to be in the ring, then this is how we're going to get our return on investment, is we're going to have him basically, be the primary person driving all the storylines. What's kind of interesting about all that, and this sort of came out in Beyond Nitro, where I did a special section looking at the attempted reprisal at the Monday Night Wars in 2010 and looking at the TNA Spike TV relationship in particular. And I did that because a lot of the principles involved in the WCW story became involved in that effort. So I thought that was an interesting sort of sidebar to delve into. And what came out of that was, in having some discussions with the Spike TV people and 𝐓𝐇𝐈𝐒 in particular, their understanding was, and they're quoted in the book as saying this, is that they were going to be getting more mileage out of Hulk actually as a wrestler. That was their understanding in terms of, should we support this deal or not, which obviously was consummated in late 2009. He debuts in 2010. But I don't think they were looking at it as, okay, we're going to get 2 or 3 matches out of this guy and he's going to be an authority figure. I think the understanding on their part was he was going to be, from time to time actively in the ring. So kind of puzzling in a way, because you think about already the physical challenges that he had to that point, and his age and the wear and tear that was on his body and the surgeries that had already occurred. And, most wrestling fans, if you were to ask them, do you think it was realistic that in 2010, 2011, Hulk Hogan was going to be, wrestling monthly on pay-per-view, or even every couple of months or quarterly? Most wrestling fans would say, of course not. It's a miracle that TNA got out of him what they did. But I just found it rather interesting that ostensibly on the Spike TV side, that wasn't their understanding and that wasn't their expectation. So I thought that was pretty interesting.
Wow, they're very interesting. And the reason behind him wrestling all the time would be a negative too, is because of his age, and he can't really move that well anymore. And it's funny, the one match he had with Sting at Bound for Glory in 2011, that was great, but it was just a crazy brawl, blood and everything else. But that's not he can do that all the time. That's a special, their big show type of thing. They definitely, I don't know, we're relying on him too much.
Oh, absolutely. And you go back and you look at that match and some of the bumps that he actually took. If you remember, he hit the canvas a few times, and the condition that he was legitimately in terms of the back problems that he had suffered leading up to that. it's like I say, it's kind of amazing that they even got that, out of the guy. And then, of course, it all culminated in, his final match being at a house show in England that obviously wasn't televised, that wasn't recorded other than the people who were actually there in attendance. So that's also another part of this, which is sort of somewhat of a tragedy, is you have this historic career that in theory should end with the send-off of all send-offs. And although I'm sure he didn't know it at the time, it actually ends up with him, being in a six-man tag on a UK tour for TNA, and that was the last time that he was in the ring. So, again, we could get into, in terms of how WWE is setting up John Cena's retirement. I mean, obviously, there's been a lot of calamities along the way, and I think the way that they've treated that heel turn. Not that I've been a sort of devoted follower of that, but just having an awareness of what's going on. They've fallen far, far short of what it could be. But regardless, the guy is still getting, a build up, and he's still getting a send off. And, that's really what you would have envisioned for a Hulk Hogan as well. So kind of sad that it all wrapped up in really inglorious fashion, I would say, much like his sort of, professional reputation as well. There's kind of some parallels there, I think.
Yeah, for sure. You're definitely right. And it is interesting with the Cena. I just kind of laugh at the heel turn because everyone was saying it was as good as Hogan, as good as the NWO, and like comparing it to Hogan. And then all of a sudden, it was a complete flop. It was terrible. And it was like, man, you had the blueprint. You were even saying it was like Hogan in the NWO. You had the blueprint for it, and you still messed up with that. So I've been following weekly. I've been following what's going on, and it was just not good either. And it was like, man, Hogan changed his look completely, went with the black and the white. I mean, his beard was different. Cena literally changed nothing. And it was just, it was like perplexing. It was like, wow, you had the blueprint from the Hulkster.
Yeah, and I think, you think back to his line, speaking of Cena, where he was sort of attempting to explain the turn, and I would say having some problems in doing that, and mentioning that, you as the fans, you don't deserve a new look, you don't deserve a new entrance song, and so on and so forth. And I don't think anyone heard that and said, "Wow, that's clever. That's a really sort of cerebral way of addressing this issue and taking the storyline." I think most people sort of rolled their eyes at that and perceived it as either a lack of effort or just total indifference. And it just seemed like, there was not going to be a lot of forethought put into that, and they were just going to kind of rest on their laurels until the end of the year. Whereas, as you mentioned, Hogan completely changed his look, completely changed his presentation, and made sure that if you were a casual viewer and you were switching through the channels, and all of a sudden you see, this character that you associate obviously with the red and yellow being this colorful presentation, figuratively and literally, that all of a sudden now he's in, the black and white, and it's reinforcing everything that he's saying and doing as his character. And I think one of the things that often gets really overlooked when you think about the Hogan turn is the way he delivered that promo in the immediate aftermath, right? Where not only did he make that moment bigger and more significant, which would seem almost impossible when if you were to just freeze time at the immediate aftermath of him, dropping the leg on Savage and signaling to the crowd that he's with Hall and Nash. That alone, was a monumental moment. But for him to then even take it 5 steps further with the way that he explained himself and the way that he'd made reference to the previous 2 years of being in WCW and summarized everything in a way that perfectly made sense. Who would know more about that organization than me? I've held my head high for 2 years dealing with you people, and the reception that you're giving me, right? All of that kind of stuff retroactively tied together, his prior history with the WWF, what had happened with WCW. Yes, it was a swerve, I suppose, for lack of a better word, but it totally made sense that if there is this invading entity and we are to believe that these guys are coming from up north to invade WCW, it completely made sense that they would align themselves with Hogan. The fact that he had been off TV for 4 months prior to that, the fact that I think they had done a very good job of not telegraphing it in the lead up. And that's not to say that, 100% of viewers would be totally blindsided by that, but, they weren't teasing it or making reference to it in such a way where it wasn't a total surprise that it would be Hogan. So, I think the fact that they dealt with it on that night, the fact that he made the moment bigger, and you contrast that to Cena, where there's a delay where everyone's waiting for this sort of expository promo. When it does happen, it's overseas. It's long, it's meandering, it doesn't particularly make sense. And like I said, by the end of the promo, it becomes evident that we're really not going to see any evolution or change in the character. Well, it's sort of like, well, why do I care about this then? And I think that was a feeling that a lot of people had. And it's unfortunate that, you build up all of this capital, I suppose, of 20 plus years of presenting the guy, roughly speaking, in the same way, and you don't capitalize on it. When he finally makes that turn, yes, years and years after when people would have liked it to have happened, but even so, I think that's a huge missed opportunity that obviously they can't get back, and they'll never get a chance to pull off something like that again, I would say.
No, and Hogan, man, masterful, and I love that line. And I funny, I said it to my buddy last night because I was making a joke about Bischoff, and I said, "Come on, where would Bischoff be without Hogan? He'd be selling meat in the back of a truck in Minneapolis." You know what I mean? Like, just, which is a great, obviously, heel line that Hogan is nailing, but basically saying, like, "Where would you be without me?" Like, just really great stuff. Just what a great promo, and then the trash in the ring and everything else, just home run.
Perfect. Perfect. If you were to have scripted that in a very controlled environment, right, where you were doing multiple takes and you were instructing the audience exactly how we need you to react to get this over the top, that's what you would have come up with, right? It was just the perfect confluence of the crowd, the people involved, the reaction, the promo, the interplay between Mean Gene and Hogan, Bobby Heenan. Of course, there'll always be debates over did that detract from the moment or not, his interjecting as Hogan is entering the ring. But the fact that you had that history between Heenan and Hogan, the way that Schiavone was, crestfallen, it appeared on commentary, and couldn't believe what he was seeing. We have witnessed the end of Hulkamania. Just absolutely perfect. And I think, again, we always talk about these sort of ethereal moments that we could show a non-wrestling fan, right? If you were to have someone in your life that was like, why do you care about this stuff? What's the appeal? I want to understand it. Show me something. It's like, to me, I would show the Hogan turn, because they're going to have a prior awareness of who Hulk Hogan is, and they're going to associate him mostly with being this uber good guy. I may show them something like, if we're talking about WCW, I may show them a Goldberg versus Hogan, right, which again involves the same guy. Or if I, if I wanted to show them sort of the peak of crowd reaction, excitement, interplay between the wrestlers and the audience, I would show them Rock versus Hogan, right? I wouldn't necessarily pull out a 17-star match where there's all of this acrobatics, which, don't get me wrong, is incredibly impressive and certainly deserves all the plaudits that it gets. But in terms of having that mass appeal, the fact is that a charismatic figure like a Hulk Hogan, who on paper is not really doing that much and has a limited in-ring ability, is always going to be able to connect with a wider population of people versus someone who has world-class athleticism but perhaps doesn't have that same charisma. And I think we can talk about how the wrestling business has changed, and certainly it has, but I think that fact is always going to be paramount and always going to be present, that that it factor, to use that cliche, that whatever you want to call it, there was something about him that couldn't be taught, something that was inherent, something that gave him just an unparalleled instinct as to what to do and when to do it in the ring and in front of people, in public appearances, in interviews, on talk shows. The way that the guy conducted himself and forged that connection with the crowd, again, that's really sets him apart from pretty much the large majority of wrestlers who ever worked in the business.
When you look at it too, it's like, man, who could have like that kind of like impact on wrestling? Very, very few guys, as far as just the astronomical impact he had. It's just, man, like he made it bigger than ever, made it global. Without him, I don't know where Vince would be. I know Vince, obviously genius as far as business and everything, but where would he be without the right guy making the right moves, making the money? It's just crazy. And I was actually yesterday looking up this stat, and it was something to the effect of he, in his Hogan era title run, he had an average of 10,300 something fans per show, at least 4 days a week for at least 4.5 years. I was like, wait a second. I was like, oh my God, he's drawing at least over 40,000 fans a week, at least for over 4.5 years. It's like, what in that? Like that? Who else could do that and have that kind of impact and be that kind of draw? And it's just, it's like insane. It's like, man, like Vince, yes, it's part of him too, but without Hogan, how do you do, you know what I mean? Without that star power, I don't know if you could pull that off.
Absolutely. I think it speaks to, again, it's a cliche, but when people in the business say that this is a star-driven business, I think we should listen to them, because I think at times as fans, perhaps we engage in like an overweighting of the creative process, and sort of can trick ourselves at times into thinking that what leads to these booms or these upticks in business is a great storyline or a great angle, and of course that is a major contributing factor in terms of a promotions business improving. But you don't get to the levels that we're talking about based on a great wrestling storyline, right? It's fundamentally it's about the person, the character who's at the heart of everything, who can take, in some cases, bad material and make it, passable, or even make it great, who can, make something out of nothing, who can allow you as a fan to perhaps look past some of the elements of a presentation that don't entirely make sense. But for some reason, when they're involved, it does all tie together and it does make sense. So it's always going to be that way in wrestling. And that's not to say that the ideas and the storylines that are being fed into those people doesn't matter. It's just that you can't have one without the other. You can't sit here and say, well, if Stone Cold and The Rock were given horrible creative, they still would have got where they got. That isn't the case. But if you were to give that same creative to other guys, it wouldn't have had anywhere near the impact, is my point. So again, it kind of circles back, I think, to the start of our conversation in terms of the importance that he played, and the fact that I think only Hulk Hogan could have had the impact that he did. Only Hulk Hogan could have taken that thing, as you said, not only nationally but internationally as well. And that's a very important thing that deserves to be documented in a book series like this.
They always say, like, oh, could have been Dusty, could have been Macho Man, could have been Kerry Von Erich. Like, they're saying all these different people. Well, I don't know if that's necessarily the case, because when Hogan's at the top of the food chain and he's at the top of the pyramid there, everybody else kind of falls into their rightful place and kind of their right positioning. So I don't know if Dusty, who was obviously a huge territorial star and a big star in certain areas, I don't know if he would have global impact. I don't know if Kerry Von Erich was that dependable, to be honest. I don't know if Macho Man, although he's definitely kind of like the 1A or 1B to Hogan's 1A, if you will. I just don't know if Macho Man has the impact of the Hulkster because of the, just the absolute just presence of Hulk. So it is hard to say, but I don't think anybody could have done what Hogan did.
No, I think we're in agreement on that. And again, that's putting to the side, and I think you'll see this when the final product comes out. I think one of the things I would like to think that I do well in my books, and I think that people appreciate, is taking a critical view on these important figures, on these important topics. So I think you're going to hear from a wide variety of people and different perspectives. There's going to be some people that think, when you look at it, on balance, the guy's contributions to the wrestling business were overwhelmingly positive. There's going to be other people that say the opposite. There's going to be other people that may be undecided. And ultimately, it's going to be up to the reader to sort of take away what they will from that and make up their own minds about it. And perhaps it will confirm or cause them to rethink, their prior assumptions before reading the book. But all of that nuance we can get into. But if you just look at it objectively, again, the guy's impact can't be denied, and he is the Michael Jordan, the Babe Ruth of the wrestling business. Regardless of the heights that Stone Cold reached at his peak, obviously The Rock, not only in wrestling but what he's been able to do, outside of the wrestling business as well. They're on Mount Rushmore, I would say, or at least you could make a very, very good argument for that. But I still think to this day, undoubtedly, we're talking about the most famous wrestler who ever lived. And, on the day that he died, I noticed that there were a number of commentators, even some people that you wouldn't even expect to be talking about wrestling, who made the point in some form or fashion that event, him passing away, was for one day at least, and this could kind of sound like a hyperbolic statement. Perhaps as we get into the future, we'll sort of forget what that time was like, but it really isn't if you think about it. They made the point that it was for one day arguably the most discussed event in the entire Western world, right, was the fact that Hulk Hogan had passed. And you think about all of the things that are constantly happening in our world, geopolitically, and the wars that are breaking out, wars that are going on. Every day there's a new issue to talk about. But for that one day at least, that was not only in social media, but across the mass media and just in society itself, a massive, public event that people were talking about. And, again, some of the other wrestlers who have reached, fame and notoriety with the masses, I think you're going to see a version of that. And you have seen a version of that when, unfortunately, they have, reached the end of their life as well. But what we saw in the aftermath of Hulk Hogan's death was, I would say, completely unprecedented.
I agree. The coverage of that was just nuts. It was everybody was talking about it. Everybody was covering. I've never seen a death or something or a story like that be covered. Even like Ozzy Osbourne, who's super famous and just ridiculous, he destroyed the coverage of Ozzy's coverage. It was like almost like mind blowing. It was like, whoa, the coverage for Hogan's death, the documentaries that TMZ did and everything else. But there were so many people coming out of the woodworks and random stations talking about it and covering it. I've never seen that before, kind of ever, really, as far as that coverage. I thought that was totally crazy.
Yeah, and you think about even, in the UK where I'm from, the fact that they sort of presented a breaking news update on the BBC about Hulk Hogan passing away. Again, I don't think you're going to see that with the large majority of any other wrestler. The fact that, again, we won't get into this direction, but just looking at it objectively, the fact that the governor of Florida is announcing a Hulk Hogan Day, the fact that the president of the United States is releasing numerous statements talking about the guy, that's just that speaks to his significance, and the fact that he truly did transcend, far beyond the wrestling business and make a serious impact for a long period of time on, again, many people that you wouldn't even anticipate would be fans of wrestling or even have an awareness of the wrestling business. And once again, unparalleled in that regard.
Yeah, it was absolutely nuts how many people were talking about it, covering it. Just shows you the cultural impact, again, of the Hulkster and how famous he was and how popular he was and just how, everybody knew who he was. I mean, it's just nuts. That's also why I do think, like, as far as getting into the movies, he was Hulk Hogan. Everybody saw him as Hulk Hogan. It's not like he could play another character. You know what I mean? Like, everyone's like, that's Hulk. He just was so famous it almost hurt himself a little bit.
Oh, that's right. Yeah. I mean, that's an interesting thing, isn't it? When you get typecast by your own fame, right? Because
Yes.
yeah,
Yep.
absolutely. Regardless of whether he shaved the mustache or not, or whatever, he was always going to be Hulk Hogan in whatever role that he played. You're right.
I was just watching that Nitro where Kevin Sullivan shaves his mustache. I'm like, I know he's doing it for a role, but I was like, I don't think people are going to think like, oh, that's not Hulk. They're still going to know that it's Hulk Hogan.
Absolutely.
So with Hulk, I mean, obviously, his legacy and his impact is crazy. Just another like small thing, but really big in the grand scheme of just like positivity throwing out there for the Hulkster. The Make-A-Wish Foundation, which obviously John Cena now has kind of taken that ball and ran with it and done such a remarkable job doing all that work for the Make-A-Wish Foundation. Without Hulk, and they've actually said this, without Hulk, Make-A-Wish Foundation kind of doesn't exist as we know it, so so to speak. So if you look at Hulk was like the original Make-A-Wish guy and the wish granter, and it just shows me like the side of Hulk maybe that people forget or people don't talk about enough. It's like, man, he was doing Make-A-Wish before people really got behind Make-A-Wish.
That's right. And again, I think a lot of these things get swept under the rug, don't they, when the discussion purely revolves around the horrible statements that the guy made and the way that he really disgraced himself in many ways, unfortunately, towards the end of his life. And we forget the fact that he, like any other public figure, and dare I say any other human being, is a multifaceted person and is capable of doing some great things and perhaps doing some not so great things. And if we're being honest with ourselves, we kind of need to recognize that, because no one is wholly, good, or I mean, we may have some people who are wholly bad, unfortunately, because of things that have happened to them. But you can't, again, sweep that under the rug, and you can't discount the fact that that does count for something. I think about a story that David Penzer actually shared in his first book that I worked with him on, where they were in St. Petersburg, and I think David happened to be photocopying some formats, so he wasn't sort of supposed to be in the room, so to speak, while this was happening. But basically, Hulk was backstage, and they brought in a family who unfortunately had a child that was, in a very bad way, in terms of being sort of disfigured and really suffering, and wanted to meet Hulk as part of the Make-A-Wish Foundation, as you talked about. And David talked about, the grace that Hulk had in dealing with this family, and how, even though unfortunately, things were not looking good for the child, at least in that moment, he was able to give the family a reprieve and give them his entire attention and make them feel like they were the most important people, to him at that particular time. And then after spending, a great deal of time with them, he went out and wrestled on that show. And, you might say, if you're going to be cynical, well, yeah, that comes with the territory. If you're going to be getting paid millions of dollars and you're going to be a celebrity, that's part of the deal. But if we were to sort of put ourselves, in that moment, I'm not sure that everyone would necessarily be capable of that, of being able to sort of retain their composure and relate to a family under such stress and going through such grief, and been able to really make a positive impact on them and do something, truly kind for them, and then switch gears and be this character in front of, millions of people. So no doubt there are innumerable stories, and I'm sure they'll come out in this book series, of similar things that the guy did. And so that all needs to be part of the ledger, I suppose, when we look at the positives and the negatives, right? We can't forget that, even though you could say a lot of it was fraudulent, a lot of it was disingenuous, a lot of it turned out to be BS in terms of what he believed in and the values that he was espousing, the fact that he did have this impact on many, many people, and was a definite, cultural figure and a huge part of people's upbringing. And like I say, I think all of that will come out.
There is obviously, two sides to every story, and you're going to be covering both sides, really, and maybe even a third side of the Hulkster, and really, get his story out there and get everything out there. It's just, to me, it's remarkable that we can almost forget the impact, because without him, wrestling isn't what it is today. Wrestling isn't worth $9 billion without Hulk. I mean, who the heck knows? Well, what wrestling was without Hulk. I know some people will say, "Oh, it could have spawned into this, it could have spawned into that," but right now it's worth multiple billions of dollars, and really on the back of what we see in basically every opening video package, him slamming Andre, him posing. You know what I mean? A lot of this can be attributed to the Hulkster.
Absolutely. I mean, you won't get any argument from me when it comes to that. And as you said, and as we already covered, in terms of getting all of these perspectives and different sides, that's going to be one of the most rewarding things about this, is allowing all of these various people to have their voice and have their say. Let's not kid ourselves. I mean, even when the guy was on top, there were a lot of people, as you know, from talking to them so often over the years, a lot of people who were not necessarily the biggest fans of Hulk, and whether that was, professional jealousy in some cases, whether that was them being privy to things that those on the outside were not going to be privy to. Again, I think we can make that determination, hopefully, after reading, this series of books. But, there were some wrestlers who would say, well, I want to be on the same card as Hulk Hogan because I know I'm going to make money. If this guy is the main event, I want to be booked on that show. Other guys, the rhetoric is more around, he was holding people back. He only cared about himself. He was protective of his spot, and so on and so forth. So I suppose it depends on what your ceiling was as a performer and how, you chose to look at it in that instance. But I think that the same is the case when it comes to, his impact on fans as well. I think there's, a contingent, and it's a sizable contingent, and no one's saying that they're wrong necessarily, that say, you know what, after I saw what this guy was really like, not only on the infamous video, but people forget sometimes the conversations that were recorded with his son when his son was in jail, and some of the things that were said, and people truly got a look at someone that obviously was speaking in such a way where they didn't believe this was ever going to come out. So you truly saw I suppose one way of looking at it is you kind of saw the real person there, stripped bare of all of the pretenses and all of the theatrical presentation. And some people looked at that and said, that's an ugly sight. And this makes me think very differently about the fact that I used to be inspired by this person. I can't believe that I was taken in by this. I don't like the fact that in their private life, someone can be one way, and in their public life, they're going to be another way. And then, of course, you have other people that say, well, that's, to some degree or another, that's more or less true with many, many public figures, right? Just because they are portraying a role doesn't mean that that's necessarily reflective of their true personality. But to get to the heart of all of these questions, I think what I need to do is continue to speak to the people who actually knew Terry Bollea, the real person, who can sort of provide some context as to why he did the things that he did, why he said the things that he said, where he was, in different points in his life. And again, let us all sort of look back and consider both sides of the ledger, which I think we would all hope happens at the end of our life as well, right? Where we're going to have some people that say that guy was great. Other people said, well, I didn't like that he said or did this. But we would like to hope that there would be a true accounting of the impact that we had. And okay, if you want to look at the negatives, let's also look at the positives as well. So I think I would like to think in the style of certainly the NITRO book series and the other books that I've done, that you're going to see a very similar approach in this case as well.
Right, as we hit the wind down here, head towards the finish, give us one last big push for the Kickstarter campaign for the Hulk Hogan Story, a biographical trilogy series.
Well, first, John, thank you again for the time. And I know we were throwing this together on late notice, so I appreciate you making time for this morning. So we're talking about the Kickstarter campaign, which is going to launch officially on the 21st, okay, the 21st of October, 10/21. You can go to Kickstarter right now, type in the Hulk Hogan Story. That's the working title we have for, as John said, this biographical trilogy. And there should be a button that you can see there on the main page where you can sign up for updates or to be notified when the project actually launches. So if you can do that, that would ensure that on the 21st, you'll get an email saying that everything now is up and running. And I'm really looking to partner with as many people as possible to bring this to light. As I talked about, at the beginning of the conversation, there are some things professionally that in order to focus on this, I am going to have to say no to. And there are some things that I'm going to have to certainly delay because this is the project that I would absolutely like to focus on. But in order to do that, like I said, I'm looking for you guys to help make this a reality. But there's also, again, as we talked about, a huge benefit in doing so, because you are effectively either ensuring that you're pre-ordering the books at a discounted rate, or based on or dependent on your level of support, you may in fact be securing a version of the book which is only going to be exclusive to this Kickstarter campaign. So if everyone, once you hear this, could do us a favor, go to the Kickstarter page, the Hulk Hogan Story, sign up to be notified, support us on the 21st of October, help get the word out, and let's make this thing a reality. And I think you'll be very happy with getting 3 massive books that may or may not fit through your mailbox when this whole thing is done.
Yeah, sometimes those books can get pretty big. I know you put a lot of effort into it, because I have NITRO and Beyond NITRO. It's pretty substantial. I can knock somebody out with them, I think.
Exactly. So that's my goal with this as well, John, that you can have another weapon to hit someone over the head with.
Nice, love that. So where can everybody find and follow you as far as social media?
Yeah, so you can find me on X. Guy Evans Books is my handle, Guy Evans Books. You can also go to guyevansbooks.com if maybe this is the first time you're hearing about Beyond NITRO or some of the other books. All of the books are available there. Of course, they're on Amazon as well. And the Kickstarter page, though, will sort of be the hub of activity for the next month or two. But just keep that date in mind. 10/21, that's when all the fun is going to begin, and I think this is going to be a great thing for everyone interested in wrestling books, and we're going to produce something that certainly hasn't been done before. So yeah, Guy Evans Books on X, GuyEvansBooks.com, and then the Kickstarter campaign, the Hulk Hogan Story.
All right, Guy, thank you so much for all the time today. Really appreciate it. Thank you so much.
You're welcome, John. Thank you.